I'm David Bank, and from Impact Alpha, this is Agents of Impact, our series of interviews with changemakers in and out of impact investing.
Other investors also don't like discussing their failure because they see it as a weakness rather than, we should be talking about this because we don't want to keep repeating the same thing. But I feel like there just aren't a lot of people who seem to want to have those conversations. So I personally would welcome having a lot more discussion around failure and a lot less discussion about how great we are, which I feel there's far too much of.
That's Diane Isenberg, founder of Ceniarth, a family office that provides capital for positive impact in marginalized, primarily rural populations. I spoke with Diane about family wealth, catalytic capital, and impact-first investing. Let's jump right into our conversation. Hi, Diane.
Hi, David.
Let's just make sure everybody knows who you are. Ceniarth, I think, is a little bit familiar to Impact Alpha readers and listeners because you've been such a great repeat contributor of guest posts, for which we thank you. And we've also covered a number of initiatives of Ceniarth, including your quick response on small business COVID loans, which I also want to get to in a moment. But I don't think we've really had a chance to get to know you personally. So it's great to be with you, even on a podcast. Folks can't see you, but I had a bit of video around, I think, the farmhouse in Wales where you are. Do you want to just tell folks, where you're sitting as we speak?
I live full-time in rural Wales. I live in the least densely populated county in England or Wales. It's very rural, primarily reliant on agriculture. I've lived here for 35 years, and I live on our family farm, which is 350 acres, which is a pretty typical size for a Welsh hill farm, and we farm primarily livestock, although we do have chickens, and I have a very large vegetable garden for my own use.
And livestock means sheep?
Sheep and what are called suckler cows, which I don't need to go into it, but you basically have cows. You always have the cows, and then you put them into calves. So you're selling their calves for meat once they're of a certain size. And everything is grass fed. Everything is grass fed. As we grow,
I was going to ask you. So, it's grass fed, and is it all regenerative and carbon negative?
I would call it sustainable farming, which is one of the reasons why we're very focused on sustainable farming, agriculture, and rural resilience.
Indeed. Okay. All good topics to dig into. Let me just, for folks who need a refresher, I'm just going to I pulled up the headlines that we've had in Impact Alpha, and then I thought the headlines actually tell the story. So let me just read a few of the headlines, and if folks are interested, they can obviously go into the site and click on them. And this was the CDFI Community Development COVID loan story, but with zero interest loans and deposits, wealthy families rush capital to rural lenders in impoverished communities. Another one, for Ceniarth's impact first portfolio, catalytic just means reasonable. Another one, how Ceniarth is seeking higher impact on rural livelihoods while preserving its own capital. And the last one, which I think was your column, fighting poverty and remaining rich. So that last one was this whole notion of impact first capital preservation, which is, I think, an innovation that Ceniarth has shared with other impact investors, particularly family offices like yourself. So now that's the background. Ceniarth is your family office, is that right?
It is. That is right.
Describe it a little bit and how it came to be and what you're trying to do with it.
Well, we're a single family office, and I founded it in 2013, and it manages both our family's private foundation, which is the Isenberg Family Charitable Foundation, as well as my own personal assets. And certainly from the beginning, I absolutely knew what I wanted to focus on, which was deploying capital into marginalized and vulnerable communities. But I was uncertain what the precise path would be to do that. For a little background on this, this was something that virtually happened overnight to me. So I was living, my life here in Wales. I've been a teacher. I've been a community activist. I've worked for the Fair Trade Foundation in Wales. I obviously worked on the farm, but I had never worked in finance. So, it was in some ways something that happened very quickly and something that although I didn't feel prepared from a expertise in finance, I certainly felt that I knew what I wanted to do.
Just to be clear, when you say it happened quickly, I think you mean came into wealth, and the wealth is,
That
I believe,
okay.
from your father and neighbors' industries.
Yes.
If I read
So
my
I mean,
bios correctly,
to
yes.
clarify, apologies if that was a bit vague. Um, Basically, my father became um, insanely wealthy, in my opinion, um, over a relatively short period of time. This would be a whole nother conversation about my views on, um, the kinds of compensations that people were getting. But at least he built a company rather than killing a company and getting the same compensation as often happens. But this
Hmm.
all really happened when I was an adult. So it's not something that's part of my background. My father was his parents were immigrants. One could say he was hungry, and I was the daughter of a very ambitious, hungry business person who ultimately
Hmm.
seemed to have a gift for building companies. And when he became incapacitated, which was over a very short period of time, I then found myself custodian of our family assets. So it was very much focusing on how I would achieve the goal that I already knew that I had, which really had been formulated by my personal experiences living here in Wales and also my background in public health, where I had spent time working in Bangladesh and what I view as basic human rights: food, shelter, healthcare, clean water, sanitation, energy, education work, were things that people didn't have access to. So I think a lot of those beliefs really underpin our work at Ceniarth on rural livelihoods.
Well, that's fascinating because, as you say, you had these experiences in Bangladesh and elsewhere, and you then also had this new experience of having considerable wealth. And it's one of these things that's awkward to talk about. I find in impact investing is that there is quite a lot of wealth involved, and folks are often talking about poverty, and they're not so much often talking about wealth. Um, and so it's always been refreshing to me how kind of forthright and just direct you are about talking about your own wealth. Has that a I don't know how to ask the question, but I mean, is that is can you what can you say about the journey of sort of just understanding all of these dynamics and perhaps contradictions?
I mean, I feel as I think I've used the word twice already. I feel like I'm a custodian. I don't really feel like it's my money or my family's money. I feel it's like pretty random and arbitrary that I happen to be the daughter of this man who happened to make a huge amount of money. And I have pretty strong views about, I suppose, being the responsibility that goes along with having all this money. And I do feel like that is reflected in the kind of family office that we run and in the sort of orientation that we have. I guess with influences, I do think that my father had a big influence on me. My father was somebody who really was orientated towards turning around poorly run businesses. He was of the age where innovation was really kind of a foreign word, I would say, outside something like the space program.
Hmm.
Um, you know, and the whole Silicon Valley money proposition was something that was not part of his world, and I think that sort of money is in some ways a different kind of what goes on there, and the kind of investing that goes on from there is quite different from what I was familiar with, I guess.
Interesting. Interesting. I think that may inform this impact first capital preservation strategy, which I want to dig into a little bit. I've always loved this quote of yours from Impact Alpha a while back. If you are rich today and invest in a manner that generates deep impact and returns your capital with a yield in line with inflation and reasonable expenses, you will still be rich tomorrow. And um, it's just so straightforward. But it means, I think, that you don't need to chase, so-called market rate returns, if what you're doing with your capital is impact first. Just how did you come to develop all that and come to that kind of formulation?
I think actually that it was a result of realizing that for the focus that we have, um, double bottom line returns just didn't work. Because originally when I got involved in this, I did a lot of reading. I'd never heard of impact investing. I was fortunate enough to meet Greg, and we were able to work, and we still do work incredibly closely together as
That's Greg Knight,
co-directors. That's Greg
Greg
Nietzsche.
Knighton, your co-director. Yeah, Nitchin.
Yeah,
Oh,
Nietzsche.
oh,
Yep.
actually, it's Nitchin. Okay, that's one
It's
thing I
Nietzsche.
didn't know how to
It's
pronounce.
Ceniarth and Nietzsche. We got those
Okay,
two nailed
Ceniarth. For the
today.
record, it's Ceniarth, which is a Welsh word, I would guess.
Yeah. So,
Ceniarth. Sorry, this is a digression, but people do want to know what Ceniarth
sorry.
means. Sorry,
Well,
then we'll get back to your story. I
interestingly enough,
apologize.
most Welsh words mean something, but I live in Welsh speaking Wales. So my children actually attended Welsh language elementary school. We're in one of the pockets of Welsh speakers, which is a very different language from Gaelic, Gaelic, and English, related to Breton, if anyone's interested. And basically, sorry. So it doesn't mean anything. But when you have fields, for example, you would have a field, Kai Gwyn, Kai is field, Gwyn is white. So if you had white stones in the field, they would call that field Kai Gwyn. So virtually everything is named here, like every field, every hill. But our farm doesn't actually mean anything.
Oh, that's the name of the farm.
Yeah, that's the name of the farm.
Gotcha. Okay, so it's the name of the farm and the name of the farm and the name of the fund, and it doesn't mean anything. It can be filled with meaning. Okay, now back to the meaning you're filling it with.
Anyway, I suppose back to how we came up with capital preservation was, originally I really bought into the double bottom line solution as being able to develop markets that I felt had been failed through both philanthropy and formal development. I come from a public health development background, and it was clear to me that that was not an effective long-term strategy, and neither had philanthropy. So I was willing to accept the proposition that you could develop these markets, and you could do well and do good. It became fairly apparent quite quickly, because I suppose it was almost quite random, but one of our first investments was in the energy access um, area in solar home systems. We basically predominantly focus on debt, and we continue to do that to this day. I can explain why later if you ask me. So we really ended up getting in the position where we had a number of outstanding debt to a number of different solar home, either intermediaries or direct investments. And we were having to restructure our loans because the default rate was just out of control. And this tended to be in the very deep rural, most marginalized agrarian areas, primarily in sub-Saharan Africa, which is where we wanted to focus. So it became abundantly clear to us that these models were not working. In the meantime, there was this tap was on full stream of equity that was flowing in. So it kind of blurred for quite a long time the actual reality of the situation.
as money poured
which
into the
that
off-grid companies, but
yeah,
the
to the
customers weren't.
off-grid companies. And I think you probably know the number of companies now, a huge number of companies have either completely pivoted to something else and have gone, up market, peri-urban, like off-grid electric. There are other countries, Mobisol, as you know, went bust. There are a lot of them, or a lot of them were sort of bought up by, like NG has bought quite a few, and
Right.
I think at fairly low valuations. So I do think there's a shaking out now that's going to make sense, but there's still, from our perspective, the concern was always the consumer and what was happening to the consumer. And I was very disturbed by the fact that a lot of these entrepreneurs seemed to not care at all what was happening to them, because they had sold them a promise. They actually weren't able to come up with a model that these rural, very poor people who really had little disposable income could afford. And they had put this out, money had already gone on, they put down deposits, and they were having to return to using kerosene and candles with a useless asset, because it had been remotely turned off, that probably was going to be repossessed. So that was the first indicator to me that this was a false promise, that
Hmm.
this
Hmm.
double bottom um, strategy was not going to work with the markets that we want to move in, and we want to work in, and we have deep commitment towards.
Meaning truly low income, and not, and as you say,
Yeah, always truly low income,
many of
and
these
sticking
enterprises
with that.
move up into a lower middle kind of
They have,
yeah.
they do. And also, when you have I mean, there's that whole friction when you have conventional equity investors that are looking to the exit. Then of course there's that, always that pressure to capture market share, to get the price point down, to increase margins. And the easiest way to do that is to move upstream. It's
Hmm.
very, very challenging to work in the with the populations, and the sectors that we are committed to, and hence why capital preservation was born. So this, it's not like we're particularly ennobled. If that double market, a double bottom return, market rate capital had worked, we would have used that, and then we would have had more money to commit and devote towards helping to ensure that the most marginalized populations and communities had access to quality goods and services at an affordable price point.
But this then leads you, just to connect the dots, this leads you to capital preservation, because you say a different kind of capital is required, that is not that
Exact.
profit maximizing venture money, and but it's not philanthropy either, and you figured out that debt was the instrument, and you came up with kind of facilities or mechanisms that might work.
Exactly. But I mean, as you're well aware, I think since we started, what I often find amusing is when we started, this was what we did was concessionary capital, and there were, I had, over the years, there were a few little sort of snide comments about what we did. That
In
when
the
people are like,
impact
"There's
world.
no need for this," yeah, for concessionary capital. Now we've been elevated. We're catalytic, because all of a sudden, I think there's a recognition, which we are deeply grateful for, by a lot of foundations who we work closely with. MacArthur is one, Kellogg is one. There are numerous foundations. We've just worked with the Schmidt Foundation, and also with Packard on the loan the fund that we got together for PPP that you had mentioned earlier. But I feel like there's much more of a stake in the ground with a number of these foundations to use their capital in a way that the blended finance that works well with our capital, and a lot of development banks as well. I do feel like the high net worths haven't really stepped up yet. Um,
Well,
and
that's what I would love your thoughts on that, because this catalytic capital, I will confess that we are part of that perhaps rebranding or elevation. In full disclosure, we've had a sponsorship with the Catalytic Capital Consortium to do just that, and so we've elevated various examples of that kind of catalytic capital, which, as you say, may be quote concessionary on the one hand, but is also can be quite high leverage, certainly from an impact basis on the other hand. And so, if what you're trying to do is move markets or change systems, we're all very much in vogue these days. Catalytic capital obviously
Well,
is a very powerful tool, and frankly, the part that's in most short supply in the impact investing ecosystem, which is why family offices like Ceniarth are considered so key. But you say maybe other families offices are not stepping up so much. So let me know your thoughts about that.
well, I mean, I know they're not stepping up as much as they could be because we're. It's amazing how often we're asked to be that piece. So if we're asked, we're often, um, the tranche that is subordinated. Um,
Hmm.
which is it generally it is catalytic. It doesn't have to be catalytic, but as in the return mate. I mean the whole concept to me of catalytic capital again isn't necessarily a number. It's sort of like it's what's required. So we actually have some investments that I view as catalytic, and we may be getting a market rate return for that. Not many, but we do have some of them. But the kind of the lens that we use is much more what is the impact of this investment? And as you mentioned, leverage is one of those. And for a number of them, it is a less than market rate return, and often even more so the real need for subordinated dollars, because particularly with a number of development banks, the DFC is a very good example. That's just a requirement for them. So
That's
I
a
think a good
requirement that
example
they have. A requirement that they have some risk protection from somebody
that they have
subordinated to them.
exactly. And you know what? At first, I just thought it was hysterical that that Ceniarth has to protect the United States. I thought I find it highly amusing actually. That our dollars need to protect American dollars, but I absolutely understand um, if that's what they need to do to get the money out the door. And we have a very good working relationship with DFC, and we have been subordinate to them in a number of funds, um, including, as you may know, the Global Partnerships Impact First Development Fund. Because I just wanted to mention this because I know how big you are on 10x leverage,
Hmm. Thank
um,
you.
and I actually was thinking, and the only investment that we've had that has actually had 10x leverage, as far as we were able to lever 10x, was with this DFC investment that we did. Oh, so we invested along with Kellogg Foundation in the subordinate tranche, and we were able to catalyze $10 for every $1 that we put in, and it was a $55 million Impact First
And just and
development
just
fund, as
just
I
so folks
mentioned.
understand, just so folks understand that, and that fund would go towards what kinds of things?
It's with Global Partnerships. So Global Partnerships is again, it's an organization that's based in Seattle, and we are invested in, I believe, four of their funds. They are a financial intermediary. They work primarily with microfinance organizations in Latin America, in sub-Saharan Africa. And what's unique about them, first of all, is they're a nonprofit organization. They generally people have notes with them, and you generally have a 2% return. So people understand that they're not going to be getting a market rate return, but what you get in exchange is hugely, highly impactful specialist MFIs, where they have a commitment to be serving the poorest segment of the population, because there's a whole you can look at whether people are earning less than $3.20. Then there's $5.50. They kind of are change it every few years, but I believe that's where it's at now. And the poorest would be $3.20 a day. And to ensure that you're serving those populations who tend to have the most lumpy incomes, tend to be the most insecure, tend to have no collateral, it can be more challenging for a microfinance institution. So they provide um, working capital debt to those financial CDFIs, not CDFIs, microfinance institutions. I apologize for that. And they have found we went to Guatemala in October, and it was just incredible the partners that they have been able to find. A lot of those also are nonprofits that are serving as microfinance institutions, but the kind of add-on that they had, the technical assistance, the partnerships with health care providers, it was pretty phenomenal. So that compared to sort of a vanilla tier one microfinance institution that you might be if you are investing in an MBI, is they're light years away from each other.
Hmm.
The
Hmm.
kind of impact that you're getting. So I think that nuance, I guess that's what I would really like to emphasize to people who are interested in this. The difference that accepting a lower rate of return can have in who you're impacting and how you're impacting them is huge. It's absolutely huge. And I want you to know that Global Partnerships virtually has never lost a dollar.
Well,
So, which is why, we have total confidence in them, in anything they do. And with this particular fund, they're able to go even deeper because they were able to get capital from the DFC at I probably at a very generously low return.
I just want to pick up on your you raised the CDFIs, which are in effect the domestic versions, and there's parallels of the sort of financial systems of the microfinance institutions overseas. But you've also been working now, particularly in the COVID context, with CDFIs, community development finance institutions in the U.S., also serving underserved populations. So there's sort of a little parallelism between the global context and the U.S. context in COVID, both of which the mainstream financial systems don't reach down, like as you say, to the needs of many businesses and individuals. So the loan facility you guys helped put together for CDFIs, as again you said you were maybe the token family office that would come in with that kind of capital. I think a few others came in after you.
Well, I mean, as I said, we were delighted with the interest that others had. The Olamina Fund also participated in the small fund that it wasn't small, the $11 million fund that we raised, as did Packard and the Schmidt Foundation. And I think Greg, who will give all credit for doing this, turned that around in about 11 days. So
That was one of the staggering things. So it's just the
yeah.
speed with which that came
Well,
together.
it was needed because basically a lot of these CDFIs actually didn't have the correct certification to be PPP providers. So what happened was we were able to use RCAC, which is California based, who did have that certification, and then other CDFIs who were part of a persistent poverty coalition were able to get the loans processed through RCAC for their customers. And a lot of people really were having these sort of poorer businesses who didn't have relationships with mainstream banks were really having difficulty accessing PPP, and this facility enabled that. I feel like, just to elaborate on CDFIs and the point that you have brought up, that there are a lot of parallels for people being, first of all, financially excluded, which is, sort of the function of a CDFI is financial inclusion, as is an MFI, often with
Mm-hmm.
technical assistance and other things that is really required by the population who needs these loans. With the CDFIs, we actually launched a program around 3 years ago because it became apparent to me, as someone who doesn't live in the US, I haven't lived in the US for 35 years. We went and attended a conference in New Orleans, and I'd never been to New Orleans. I'd never been to Louisiana, and I was absolutely overwhelmed with shame at actually holding an American passport, when I saw not only the consequences, the negative consequences that Katrina had with the rebuilding of the city, that actually further marginalized what was a great African American city, with um, changes in the education system, where they had a robust, if not necessarily a high achieving school system that was really the gateway for the middle class African American community to be built, and education was a pathway. So it was working in hospitals, and they just closed down that education system and opened up charter schools, and they virtually fired everyone. And the same thing with hospitals, and people were basically in the tragedy of people having to leave, and being housed in other cities almost as refugees within the United States. That term was actually used. In the meantime, whole sways of land seemed to be bought up, and it was a really horrific story, of systemic racism, which obviously now is coming to the forefront, and I'm hoping is going to be a movement that people feel that investors really can focus on. So we fortunately we decided then, I decided I wanted to have a U.S. Program, and it would be focused. We did some research, and it became clear that the best way that we could achieve this was through investing in CDFIs. So we already had quite a strong relationship with a number of CDFIs, and because we were focusing on the 5 persistent poverty areas, because our focus is poverty, um, we were able to pull this together quite quickly. And of course, because of the, systemic and historic racial injustice, a lot of people in poverty are people of color.
Well, and that's becoming even more apparent in the COVID context. And you guys had this post at the beginning of it that said, we are lenders, not heroes. And you've always had this very keen appreciation of like very practical work. The line from that I remember is, I think you were taking gentle pokes actually at Impact Alpha and me, because I had written something called about making this shitstorm matter, and I was promoting the notion that there was this disruptive opportunity where new things could blossom, and which I do think is true, and I'd love your thoughts on. But you guys said, while things may be different, it may not look all that different for lives of poor people around the planet. They will bear the brunt of economic disruption, social unrest, and illness. That there will, as in all crises, their plight will be highlighted, aid will be secured, and then the world will move on, as will most impact investors. And I was like, I'm sorry to say, I think you're right. But you've always just kind of tried to take the air out of the magical thinking of some of us.
Yeah, I would say that is true. I think part of it is because we talked about earlier that I view myself as a custodian, and I really do feel that unless we're doing a really great job at staying laser sharp focused on what our objectives are. I am sort of letting down the legacy of my father, and what I deeply believe in. And I, as a person, I'm a natural skeptic, and I just, part of my problem with all this, or part of the difficulty that I have, is that I'm also a very honest person, and very eager to talk about the difficulties, the problems, why things aren't working. And I find that seems to be problematic in the world of finance, because people are afraid to talk about this, you know, because as an individuals, funds, sectors, people who are not on my side. I have the money, I can say whatever I want. People who actually are asking for the
Hmm.
money, because they're scared that if they actually are, open and candid, that flow of money might stop coming. And I feel like other investors also don't like discussing their failure because they see it as a weakness rather than, we should be talking about this because we don't want to keep repeating the same thing. But I feel like there just aren't a lot of people who seem to want to have those conversations. So I personally would welcome having a lot more discussion around failure and a lot less discussion about how great we are, which I feel there's far too much of.
What do you have in mind?
Well, one of the things that I'd like to propose is the 1/10th challenge, rather than the 10x challenge, to those investors who have the flexibility in their investment returns. So this is a challenge that you just allocate 1/10 of your portfolio into impact first capital preservation opportunities. You get higher impact in your areas that you champion: racial justice, gender equality, climate, and you don't need to go 100% all in with this as we have for it to be meaningful. If everybody did a little bit, it would be hugely transformative. And I think that David sort of alluded to this in the article that we had written about COVID, but with the outsized impact that COVID's having and will continue to have on the poor and the global awakening around systemic racism, we desperately need additional impact first capital to accelerate this world getting closer to becoming equitable and just. So I throw my gauntlet down.
So the 1/10 challenge for impact first capital preservation, and we would have a foot in the door. Folks could see what capital preservation actually may turn out to be not a bad strategy all around, Diane. So thank you for that. We're going to trumpet that in Impact Alpha, and maybe that's the agenda for our next conversation.
I
So
welcome
thank
it.
you, Diane Isenberg.
And thank you, David.
That's going to do it for this episode of Agents of Impact. You can read more about Diane Isenberg and Ceniarth at impactalpha.com. Subscribers to Impact Alpha receive our daily email brief, including deal flow, job postings, and original features, as well as full access to impactalpha.com, Agents of Impact conference calls, and much more. Go to impactalpha.com/subscribe. Thanks again to Diane Isenberg and to our producer, Isaac Silk. I'm David Bank, editor and CEO of Impact Alpha. See you again soon.